Hey there, guys. This is a video on how I go about mixing ambient relaxation music, or music that you might listen to for meditation or stress relief or sleep, that sort of thing. So when you're going about approaching a mix or something, one thing you kind of want to think about is how's the music going to be listened to? What's the application of the music? What's the purpose of it? And so where is it going to be listened to? Or, what other goals do you have in mind for how it sounds on the other end? So for this type of music, it's usually used for, like I said, meditation, sleep, bringing the body and the mind out of a state of stress and into a state of safety. And so with that in mind, when I envision sort of my ideal end result, to me, the music needs to have three crucial things. It needs to be soothing and warm. It needs to be consistent in its dynamics, and it needs to be consistent in its sonics. So I'll explain that in a moment. But in general, it just needs to be easy to listen to because of that sort of goal of bringing the listener into a state where they're allowed to drift off and kind of just reap benefits of the music itself and not have to actively be using their brain too much to, interpret what they're hearing, to react to what they're hearing consciously, that is. So basically, to start off, soothing and warm. So I want the sonics of the music to be warm and sort of soft to hear. So what that means for me is I don't really want the music to have a ton of high end. I usually want ambient music to be not harsh. And that's because those things can tend to bother the human ear. Maybe it's not conscious, but those frequencies, they tend to be harsh to the human ear. And so that's definitely not something I want to have to compete with. I don't want the listener to have to be distracted by anything like that. So when I go about, recording it and mixing it, all of the various components of the music, generally speaking, if they have a lot of high frequency content, I'm probably applying some kind of a high cut if there's stuff there that I think is going to be distracting. General rule, I tend to find myself cutting, the frequencies that are above like maybe 2K, 2.5, 3K. Above that is where it starts to get a little harsh. Things like guitars can often have that. And so if I play this guitar for you, give you a little sample of this. Now, fortunately, this guitar, it's already rolled off. The tone that was used to record this instrument was low. The patch that's being played, the amp that's being played, all that stuff has been dialed back ahead of time. The highs are fairly subdued already. So I'm not having to really cut much. But if I did want to cut, I might not do something this harsh of a cut. I might actually cut it something a little bit more like this, where it's more like a 12 dB and I bring the frequency down a bit. This is what would happen if I did that. So you can tell that the effect that has is it makes the texture and the feel of that sound kind of more like it's cloudy. It's more, soothing and pillowy and soft. And that's something that to me is conducive to relaxation. So I'm cutting a lot of highs. I'm just making sure that the overall sonic feel of it is going to be relatively soft and, warm. And so you can have the low mid frequencies, you can have the bass frequencies. Those things are not as distracting, assuming they're not overly resonant. So I'll get to that a little bit later, but I'm not finding the need to cut stuff over here because a lot of times the low frequencies, even the subs and the lows and the mid lows, do kind of contribute to a pretty crucial effect. A lot of times the lower frequencies kind of have that sort of drone effect that can really put your mind into a more relaxed state. And so that was the guitar there. But up here I've got a pad, and I will play this pad. This is with everything bypassed as far as effects or plugins. There's nothing active on the master chain either. You're just hearing a print of the synth pad that was composed here. So when I look at it on an analyzer, and I just, let's see, activate this, I'm going to temporarily deactivate any sort of cuts happening. We'll just look at it on the analyzer and we'll kind of see visually how it sounds. Obviously you're using your ears too, but this is how it looks on an analyzer. So lots of mid content, a little bit of bass. It doesn't have a whole lot of subs here. And naturally it does not have many highs either. So very similar to the guitar. And that was done by design. Like I don't necessarily compose these pad sounds. I don't, program these pad sounds to be a bunch of high frequencies because I know that that's probably not what I want in the end. Anyway, I did have a cut happening here, and with the cut, this is what that pad sounds like. So the only thing that is really being affected by this is above 16K, which starts to get harder and harder for the human ear to hear this. I think the reason I had put this cut here was actually because there was some kind of weird resonance that was happening. And since it wasn't something that was really all that audible, I wanted to get rid of it anyway so that it didn't affect any kind of headroom. It didn't mess with anything else down the line. So that cut isn't really super noticeable because the pad already is fairly soft sounding. The other instruments in this particular song are just a bass. So I've got a bass synth here, and the bass is not going to have any highs either because it's meant to be a bass. All right, so here is the bass soloed. There we are. Very low. If you're listening to this on a phone or a TV or a laptop or anything like that, you're not hearing anything right now. I will pull up an analyzer so that you can at least see it. Okay. So that is essentially just a very strict band of sound. It is heavily dropped off just after 100, and it's primarily sub bass. So this is resonating very low. And this particular song, that's kind of all it needed. I mean, the pad, the guitar, those are filling in the rest of the space. I didn't really need the bass to be occupying much else as far as like low mids or anything above that. So moving right along. The second thing that I talked about earlier is consistency in dynamics. Why would we want consistency in dynamics? Well, if you're talking about music that you're trying to tune out and just let yourself drift off. If you have music that is constantly going up and down, and then it comes back louder, and then it drops back down, that can be a little bit distracting, and it's difficult to not focus on those changes in the dynamics and the loudness and the volume of stuff. So generally speaking, I kind of want somewhat of a compressed audio sound. I want something that's consistent with not too many, dips and peaks in its volume. Not so much for the purpose of making it louder in the end, but mostly just because of that consistency. I don't want to be distracted. A lot of times, let's say you listen to classical music, the most dynamic music out there. You have periods where the symphony is raging and they're at max volume. And then you have periods where they're so quiet that you have to turn your volume up just to know, are they still there? Like, did they fall asleep? Did they leave? Is the piece still going? That's definitely not what we want, because if somebody is, drifting off to sleep, or they're drifting off into relaxation, and then all of a sudden they just get, smacked with a bunch of trombones and strings and stuff, that's not really achieving the end result. So we want consistency. So this particular pad This is essentially with no effects on it. And before I even play it, you can see that it does modulate in intensity. And the reason that is because there is programmed changes in filter cutoff. There's basically automation within the pad. And it's making it so that it's more interesting at times. It's not just the same sound constantly. But with that variation, the end result is you do have some inconsistency here with its volume levels. What I want to do when I mix this is I want to reduce those dynamics. And here's a few ways that I do it. Obviously, you can go the traditional route and put a compressor on here. The traditional route of compression would be once that audio is exceeding the threshold, your compressor is clamping down and pushing it lower. And that's perfectly fine. That'll work. And when you then push all your peaks lower, you can then raise the overall volume of it. And that leaves you with a more consistent end result of your loudness. But there's a reason why you might not necessarily want to immediately reach for a traditional compressor. A lot of times, if you're talking about hitting these types of peaks with compression for the sake of reducing your dynamic range, you might be left with some strange pumping effects. You might be hearing some sort of, disturbances in the way that these waveforms initially wanted to be there. So I've noticed that whenever I have experimented with various methods of doing this. And so what I tried to do instead was I first reach for upward compression. If you have something like Ozone 11, there is a maximizer within Ozone 11. This is by Isotope that has upward compression. The other option that I have personally is FabFilter Pro MB. There is a way to get this to do upward compression as well. I'll show you all that stuff and I will explain what upward compression is. So when you're talking about traditional compression, downward compression, every time the audio exceeds the threshold level, the compressor will reduce the excess volume. With upward compression, every time the audio drops below the threshold, it boosts the level of it. So you're talking about boosting the quiet portions instead of clamping down on the louder portions. And then when it exceeds the threshold and it's, at its loudest, the compressor doesn't touch it at all. So the benefit of that is that you're not affecting any of the natural peaks here. You're only focusing on the stuff that's below that threshold that you have set, and it's gently and hopefully transparently bringing that volume back up to give you a nice consistent volume across the board. And it's not going to be as noticeable. The end goal is to make it so that there isn't as much noticeable artifacts showing up from your compressor fighting with your audio. So I'll show you what that looks like on Ozone 11. This is Ozone 11 Maximizer. And if I hit play, you will see here, I've dialed this in to boost my low portions of audio by up to 7 decibels. Now this doesn't have a whole lot of control with regard to where that threshold is. The other option I'll go over, that has a little more control, but with a little more control, it can sometimes be a little bit fussy. Sometimes it's a little difficult to just dial it in the way it sounds good. So I'm gonna go with Ozone right now and show you what happens. So when you look at this graph, this light blue line here shows where the signal is being boosted. If the signal of this audio here reaches my output level, the compressor lets go completely and it does not touch that audio. And you will see that once we get to the louder portions, you'll see this blue line drop down because it's not boosting the audio as much. One way that I can actually make this more obvious so that you can really see the difference is if I boost the gain into the limiter. This is sort of meant to be a final limiter stage for a mix, but you can certainly use it on individual stuff too. If I boost the gain on this, you will see a lot more drastic difference. The way Ozone 11 Maximizer is made is that if your audio is hitting your threshold for the limiter, then it completely lets go of the upward compression. So I boost this gain here just to demonstrate what that looks like when it completely lets go and does not do any type of upward compression at all. So it's actually reducing the gain here because it's hitting the limiter. So I'm going to back it off even more. This top line being gain reduction. It's showing you gain reduction it's doing if it's hitting the limiter. Okay, so that would be upward compression. The way that I would dial that in on Pro MB is like this. Dialing in upward compression on Pro MB. So you've got FabFilter Pro MB and you have one band. This is normally a multi-band processor. That's what MB stands for. But I'm going to go ahead and make this so that the range of the bandwidth covers the entire spectrum. So this is now a single band compressor, just like any other compressor, traditional compressor would be. So this is a single band compressor. And then down here, you have your threshold control. You have your range, attack, release, and final output, your ratio, knee, look ahead, and whether you want to compress or expand. In this case, we're going to compress because it's going to be upward compression. The way you dial in upward compression is that instead of a gain reduction happening when the signal exceeds the threshold, you're actually going to boost the gain once the signal drops below the threshold. And this is what that looks like. Also, I'm going to dial in, before I show you, I'm going to dial in fairly slow attack and release. The release especially is going to be pretty slow because I do not know if Pro MB detects audio in the same way that something like Ozone 11 Maximizer does. To me, it sounds very peak sensitive, which can be a little trickier to make something like this music not sound pumpy and unnatural. So I have to slow the release down and the attack considerably so that it's not trying to react too quickly to all the various changes in the audio it detects. So this line here, this yellow line, that's showing you any sort of gain increase. When it's down here at the baseline, it's not touching the audio. When the audio drops below the threshold, you will see this yellow line go up as it boosts your quieter parts. Now, if I turn the threshold down, that means that the audio is going to cross it easier. It's going to cross it sooner and more often. And that means that as it crosses it, the gain increase will not be there. It will not be touching that audio. Again, this is just on the pad. I can go ahead and mute that babbling brook sound, and you can hear just the pad and the rest of the stuff. Okay. So that's how you would dial in upward compression on FabFilter Pro MB. Nice alternative way to get some consistency with your dynamics without having to, clamp down too hard on the peaks. You're instead just affecting the quieter parts and boosting those. And if you spend enough time and you dial it in, it's going to be more transparent. I think I opted for Ozone 11 Maximizer in this case because to me it just was a lot easier to make it just sound like it wasn't confused by all those peaks, and thus I got a more transparent sound. So what I like to do after I have a stage of upward compression is I will then actually put a little tiny bit of downward compression and even limiting. And what I did for that in this particular case was I used Open Compressor, and this is by Woodstock Audio, which is Rob Mays from mastering.com. And this compressor, you have a lot of various capabilities built in to this. One thing that I like is I can dial in some look ahead. I can make it listen to RMS, so it's listening to average loudness instead of trying to react to peaks. And I can specify the window of time that it's listening to for that average. You can change between regular and optical models, and you can do feedback or feed forward. There's a lot of tutorials out there on what all that stuff means, but I have this set up to be pretty gooey, as Rob likes to call it. It's very conducive to, this long sort of drawn out ambient music that's not got a lot of transients. It's not got a lot of, sudden changes that your compressor needs to react to quickly. I want it to be gooey. I want it to be very, gooey. I don't know. So I've got a slower attack here. I have the release on auto. I have the knee dialed up fairly soft. You can see that down here, hard knee versus soft knee. And I will make a video on what knee actually does and what it means. A lot of people are confused and have a misconception of what that really does and sounds like, but maybe I'll make a video about that sometime. The ratio I have here is set to about a little over 4. What I have done too is I have the limiter engaged. This limiter is pre-compression. So the function of this limiter is to kind of just catch any of these sort of stray peaks before they hit the compressor so that the compressor isn't overreacting and thus sounding kind of pumpy. So you can dial in where this limiter line is. When you hit play and you see your audio moving across the screen, you'll see a line of where that limiter is going to start clamping down. So I'll show you that. So that green line right there is my limiter threshold. So since this isn't a limiting stage, I'm really not trying to just like smash this thing. I just want it to be kind of correcting some of the stray peaks so that the compressor doesn't overreact. So I'm setting it about 3.3 and then moving on. I'm not doing any sort of harmonics. I'm not doing an amplification of low level stuff. And I'm not telling it to affect the tone. I just want it to just do compression, none of the tone stuff. So the threshold here, you will see the gain reduction on this red line. So the red line shows you where that gain reduction is happening. You can also switch views to be just waveform, so you can see that in more detail. So you can see by this needle, I'm not doing a ton of gain reduction here, which is good. I don't necessarily at this stage want to be doing a ton. I'm hoping that with the limiter that's placed in front of this and the upward compression that I did previously to this, that this compressor isn't going to have to do a lot. And the reason for that is that I don't necessarily want it to be doing so much that it's obvious that the compression is happening. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you what the waveform looks like after I print those changes to this particular audio waveform. Okay, so this waveform here is essentially this waveform with those effects that I just went over printed to audio. You can visually see how much more consistent this audio is. And when I play it, it'll sound like just what we were listening to earlier. And fortunately, it's not smashing stuff. It's not Like if I zoom out, yeah, it looks like it's all sort of I don't know, deteriorating sausage or something like that. But if you zoom in, you can see that it's not really having to get super harsh on any of the peaks, okay? And so that's kind of what we want. We want the consistency, but we don't want to destroy the audio. Now I could actually go in and do the same process to my guitar if I wanted to. But in this case, I'm going to leave the guitar a little bit dynamic, and that's okay. So next up, what I want to talk about next would just be consistency in sonics. So we talked about consistency in the dynamics. I want to talk about consistency in sonics. This is not something that on this particular track I had to do a whole lot in order to achieve, because typically, you know, I have stuff that's, I'm not going back and forth between bright sounds and soft sounds. I'm not necessarily going back and forth between, you know, opening up the filter on the pad or the synth or whatever, and then opening them back down, because I'm not looking for a lot of cinematic effect. I'm looking for that sort of drone effect. But occasionally, if you do have a guitar that goes back and forth between those two things, that might be a risk that you have maybe some stuff that's going to poke out and be sort of distracting. And so if you've got something like that, what you can do is you can go into something like FabFilter Pro Q3 or Pro Q whatever. And let's say you've got, okay, let's just say hypothetically that my guitar has a resonance that pokes out too much at a certain spot. Obviously, I'm not really hearing anything terrible right now, but let's just say hypothetically that this particular peak here was a frequency that was too resonant, too harsh, and I wanted to control this. Well, one thing I can do in something like this with a dynamic EQ is I can select the band that I want to affect, make it dynamic, and then might put the gain back to 0 so that I'm not putting a cut across the entire song. But I'm going to make it so that this thing is only going to, you know, duck this particular frequency when it exceeds the thresholds. You're just looking at a very narrow frequency here that is only going to be attenuated when you're getting past the threshold. This would be the amount of attenuation that I want to let it do. And this would be my threshold. And I can do that to all of those harsh frequencies. If I feel that those are distracting, I can go crazy with it and put those everywhere if I want to. There's another method that I really like that seems to be a little more transparent, a little more effective too. And that is something that I may not even do. I could do it on individual instruments if I wanted to, but a lot of times I actually do this during the final mix down or even the mastering stage. And what that would look like is using another isotope ozone 11 feature. I will go ahead and open up part of what's on my master bus here. So I have my maximizer. This is doing upward compression on the entire mix. I'm going to disable that for now. Stabilizer. This is a spectral shaper. And so what this does is very similar to what I just showed you with dynamic EQ. With this particular one, you can tell it how much you want it to pay attention to the lows, the mids, or the highs, up to 100 being the most sensitive, 0 being ignore it completely. Over here, you have shape or cut. Cut means that it's only going to perform cuts. And that's kind of what I personally would want. I don't want it to be boosting stuff. That's what would happen if you clicked shape. It would do cuts and boosts in order to achieve what it thinks is going to be the ideal sort of flat, neutral frequency response. If it thinks that there's something that needs a boost, it's going to try to do that too. So I generally steer clear of that. I'm just looking for cuts. And so let me show you what happens when I hit play, and you'll see where it's liking to attenuate. Okay, so it's definitely focusing a little bit on that sort of 400 range. Occasionally you'll see some 500 and 600-ish stuff where it starts to cut. Speed would be how quickly it reacts. Sensitivity is just that. It's how sensitive to the sort of resonances it's going to be. The amount is how much of a cut you're going to let it do. Tame transients, I don't necessarily need to activate because this has no transients. This is literally no drums at all. If you had drums, or if you had like, cymbals or hi-hats or something that were causing some problems, you could click this and the plugin will react in a different way to what it perceives as transients from the way that it reacts to what it perceives as the sustained frequencies. So let me go ahead and play this. And what I'm going to do in this instance is I'm going to hit play, and I'm also going to hit delta. This is going to let you hear just the frequencies that it's cutting. So it will actually mute everything else and just show you what the plugin is exactly cutting. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. It's cutting this frequency here because it's thinking that that's going to be a little too resonant and it's going to be a little distracting. So that's very helpful. For me, this helps really achieve consistency in the sonics. If something starts kind of drifting and it's a little too enthusiastic, it's going to take care of that for you. And it's a nice quick way to go about it. Obviously you can do all that stuff manually. You can even automate your cuts and everything. This just kind of saves time. It's whatever works the best for you. So I really do like that plugin a lot. The other plugins I have on the master bus would just be a spectral thing. I don't have any cuts or boosts happening here. This is just so I can see the spectrum and see what's happening. And then if I am not using the maximizer in Ozone 11, then I'm just using, in this instance, Flatline 2 for straight limiting. But I think I was actually happy with the maximizer on this particular iteration. Okay, so anyway, 3 things that I like to do for mixing ambient music. You can consider this particular stuff here more consistent with the mastering stage. When I actually am ready to do final mixdowns of these songs and then master them, I do prefer to do the final mixdown, print it, and then opening up in a separate mastering session altogether that's pre-configured for using my gear here, my hardware, and doing other types of things during the mastering stage. So I don't generally just bounce it out with whatever mastering plugins are on my stereo bus. I do like to do that in a separate stage. It helps with kind of your mindset. It helps with focusing on what stage you're in. That way you don't get bogged down on jumping from stage to stage, having to go back, having to go forward. It's just kind of a workflow thing. So anyway, soothing and warm, consistent in your dynamics, and consistent in your sonics for mixing and mastering ambient music.